All right, well, thank you and welcome to the
Not
November
theirs.
Science and Engineering Council. So we have an exciting topic today with the our happiness and satisfaction really U-shaped for the over the life course. So that's what our talk's going to be. But first, I wanted to ask a couple of things. First, we really would like to recruit some more people to be on the board of the Science and Engineering Council. I've been doing this for about 20 years, and we all eventually will need to be replaced. So anybody that's on the Zoom or here in person would like to help us with the board, just see one of the board members. Yeah, let's see. There's quite a few people on our list here. But I'm going to we've got speakers lined up for December and January. So I'd like to turn it over to Mary Howe Grant to talk about what the December speaker is going to talk about. And then I'll talk a little bit about the January.
Hi, good afternoon. Yeah, I'm looking forward to December's talk. Today's talk as well, obviously, where I wouldn't be here. December, we're going to have Professor Justin Wilson, he's joined the UCSB faculty this summer. He's working on metals and the way they coordinate with various ligands called chelates that then can be used to either deliver drugs to appropriate places in the body or different ligands, different chelates that can help to take the various metals out of our electronics, our waste electronics. So we're not as dependent upon foreign countries for the rare earths, the materials that go into modern day electronics. And then in January, we have Trissalyn Nelson, and I am trying to get her title, but I don't have it right here. I'm sorry. This is support Santa Barbara's efforts to plan for a sustainable transportation and a project to build one of the first digital twins of nature for the Dangermond Preserve at Point Conception. So it'll be a very different talk, but I think it'll be as exciting as this and December's. Thank you.
And just a little bit more of a pitch for the Science and Engineering Council, in addition to holding
No, that's our
Okay, so in addition to holding these luncheons, we also support the local science fair and also support the scholarship fund. We give scholarships directly to people who are studying STEM subjects, such as engineering or biology. So we generally have 2 or 3 scholarships a year that are supported through the Scholarship Foundation. Okay, so anything I'm missing about Science and Engineering Council? Okay, so therefore, I'd like to thank Dr. Gruven for coming and speaking to us today, and I'll let him explain his talk. I'm really thankful that you donate your hour to us here. So thanks.
Great, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay in Zoom land? Okay. I think this is the first time I've ever given a talk at a bank. And maybe to engineers as well. I'm guessing based on the talk that was just described in December, that this might not be the usual domain that you typically entertain here, but hopefully you'll enjoy and get something out of this. All right, I just want to first open up. I have a new book that was just published about 2 months ago. I just did a fun thing at Chaucer's last week for a book release. You can find it at Chaucer's or wherever you like to buy books. it's called 7 Decades, How We Evolved to Live Longer. And it's a kind of different take on our longevity, on our lifespan, on aging, that in a way, differs a little bit from the sort of super hopeful, right around the corner is, the anti-aging miracle we've all been waiting for, and kind of looks back on our evolutionary history, tries to glean out some lessons, and covers, I've been working decades with small scale groups of hunter-gatherers and farmers, and lots of lessons learned about health and aging, some of which, what I talk about today, a little bit of that is in chapter 10, but this is a much broader, kind of more physiological take on aging. So anyway, if you are remotely interested in what I say today, check out the book, which I won't be talking about otherwise in this. I was asked to talk about happiness, something people who know me will be like, why the hell would anyone ask you to talk about? I'm a little grumpy, emotionally and genetically, but maybe that's it, right? If it came so natural, then maybe I wouldn't think of it as a puzzle that needs to be figured out. Anyway, so let's just start with the basic question. If I ask you this, overall, how satisfied are you with your life now? So, what's that?
So 1, 2, and you, and okay, I'll sit on this
I can mute him.
and be with.
There we go.
All right.
Sorry about
overall, how satisfied are you with your life nowadays on a scale of 0 to 10? 0, not at all satisfied. 10, completely satisfied. Think to yourself, maybe you don't like that phrasing, something like this. If you were to consider your life in general, how happy or unhappy would you say you are on the whole? 0 being fairly unhappy to 5 completely happy. You might not like this take on trying to assess your level of happiness or life satisfaction, but basically this is what most of social science and the standard kinds of questions that have been asked on like Gallup surveys and lots of surveys. So it's easy to ask, and it's quantified. Right, so that means you can sort of assess people over time. You could track, you can compare countries, you can compare males and females, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a window that I didn't invent, but it's where I'm starting from as a way to try to assess something about overall life satisfaction. And of course, it's hard to talk about something if you can't measure it. So that's something I think the scientists and engineers can appreciate, that we need to have our measures. We can debate about whether this is a good measure or not, but it's certainly an entrance into thinking about life satisfaction. And with those kinds of measures, it's been well documented that when you look at life satisfaction as a function of age, you get something that looks like this U shape. In this particular case, it looks a little bit more V-like than U, but this is called the U shape of well-being, with this idea that you start off in kind of late adolescence, young adulthood, sort of fairly happy, well off, and then things get a little bit worse when then you get to the trough. So right now, I'm apparently in the worst phase of my life. And so, but I guess on the good side of that, looking up, I only have good things to think about in the future. So that life satisfaction improves after this midlife slump or midlife crisis. This U-shape, there's been over 600 papers on the U-shape in over 100 countries. So much so this has been documented almost like as a stylized fact, that this is just something that is inherent to human beings. It certainly bled out of the academic literature into the popular literature, the happiness curve, why life gets better after 50. So it's a thing in the public zeitgeist, I guess. And just complete disclosure, I am not actually a psychologist or someone that was like heavily invested in this U-shape. If anything, I got interested in it because I was a little skeptical. But just to show you examples of what these types of data look like, here's the Europarameter data. So using, again, a similar kind of question on the whole, are you not at all satisfied, not very fairly or very satisfied with the life you lead? And this is over 36 nations, over 32,000 observations from back in 2016. And again, you can see that it's about somewhat U-shaped. This thing with and without controls is also a little bit debatable. You could think, well, what's going on with age? Certainly, you might have kids at the house and then they fledge. Maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. There's marriage, there's having kids, there's divorce, there's loss of kin, that kind of thing. And if those things tend to track with age, maybe the age effect is really just those life events. So with controls basically means adjusting for variability in those kinds of events that occur with age. And for the most part, you typically see that an age effect still exists, even when you adjust for the kinds of things that typically vary by age. And this has been taken to argue that it's something built into the life course itself as a function of our lives, rather than just the things that happen to correlate with age. Oops. Here's another example from the UK, early 2000, mid 2000s, 416,000 individuals. Again, a U shape. Now here what you see, it's a little bit different. Rather than just being completely U-shaped and increasing with age after 50, it tends to kind of flatten out in the 60s, 70s, and then sometimes it's flat, sometimes it goes down a little bit. And that's a little bit variable in high-income countries. But the general pattern of a decline, a trough, and then an increase is fairly common in a lot of these high-income country samples. So now there was a study, one study amongst great apes, also arguing that the U-shape isn't just confined to humans, but also exists in our nearest primate relatives, the great apes. So 2 samples of chimpanzees and 1 sample of orangs. Now you're like, how did the great apes answer those questions? Well, they didn't. They're smart, but these are caretakers of those apes who are kind of know those apes reasonably well, and they're filling out the forms about how happy or not they think those apes are. And so, and granted, and those people are also, they were either Japanese or American. So coming from high income countries where these U-shapes are observed, and then they get, this kind of somewhat U-shape, although the trough is a little bit different given that the mean life expectancy of all these apes is in the teens, not, nearly as high as it is in humans. And it's never been replicated to my knowledge, that there's never been a study in apes again looking at this. But this has also been taken that, again, this is not just a universal in humans, but is sort of primordial because it's a shared feature with other apes. So what I want to do today, is this U-shaped well-being curve really a human universal? And then moving beyond just yes or no, can we have a more theory-driven approach to thinking about well-being, especially I'm going to focus mostly here on after the 50s rather than before. And then if I have time, I don't know how much time I have. How long is this talk?
We generally cut off about 1:15, 1:30.
Okay. All right. Well, feel free to interrupt too. I'm used to that. You don't have to wait till the end. If I have time, I'll talk about some new initiatives and directions that gets into these topics in a lot more depth than just on a scale of 1 to 5, rate your happiness.
One question, I
Yeah.
guess, you had the mean or something of or the average on it, but what about the standard deviation? It depends on which day you ask the question sometimes.
Yeah. Well, these are kind of noisy, and just like the averages sometimes don't even represent any one individual, right?
Yeah.
The irony of some of this work, the people most excited about these U-shaped curves are not actually even psychologists. It's economists, of all people, who are used to getting lots of data, and then, it becomes real when you can graph it. And so these are average trajectories, right? Individual trajectories can be a lot more variable. I think that's why the psychologists tend to think that this isn't so useful to think about, because some individuals might show that kind of trajectory over their actual life course, but many are all over the place. And you're right, you could, if you have a big enough data, your well-being could change throughout the day. You're much less day to day. And so this is sort of kind of ironing out, maybe that's also why the question is asked in a particular way, right? There's measures that are like momentary. It was like ecological momentary assessment, where you get a ding on your phone. And it's like, right now, how are you feeling? And I could do that. And I could, if I take enough of those snapshots, I might get an average of you. But these questions are sort of like, on the whole, when you think about it, they're also cognitive appraisals, right? As opposed to more like hedonic, how are you feeling, versus we can get into the weeds about, the meaning in one's life, contentment, satisfaction versus just like hedonic type happiness. U-shape has been sort of argued as being a bit more widespread than just any simple one measure. So even independently of self-reports, diagnoses of depression, right, show like an inverted U-shape, or prescriptions for Prozac and other antidepressants, again, show similar kinds of age trajectories. And so there's other sort of independent evidence that also kind of speak perhaps to this sort of average age trajectory over the life course.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah, so do they ever like take into account like that, like early deaths in this? Like say I were to die at 18, I wouldn't be happy for the rest of my life because, I don't like being dead after 18,
Well, there's definitely like this, you're thinking about the idea of like, it's called like a mortality selection, right? The most miserable are dying out. And so who's left but the happiest?
Yeah.
And that's true. But, and especially with the cross section, right? That's vulnerable to this. But this has also been shown with longitudinal data as well. And so some of those, this is a bet. I mean, over 600 papers, lots of people have attacked sort of the methodological aspects. And I get into a little bit of this, but I'm trying to zoom out a little bit. And let's just say for the moment that there is this widely documented pattern that seems to be robust to some of these obvious critiques. So one thing that's kind of interesting about this U-shape, though, is that we can call it the health well-being paradox, right? Because if anything, after your 50s, the number of doctor appointments start piling up. Our health isn't necessarily always getting better, right? It's often getting worse. And our social networks sometimes become a little bit thin. We start losing people in our network, moving away, passing away, etc. So if anything, there's some unpleasantness that awaits, yet ironically, well-being seems to be improving, getting higher. So that's been called this health well-being paradox. So we'll kind of return to that. But what I do want to first ask this question, is this U-shape really universal? Well, anyone ever heard of the weird problem? Probably not. So this idea that most of psychologists and economics and most of the social sciences in general, everything we take for granted that we think we know about human nature and human preferences and stuff like that, almost all of those studies have been done in the West. Also in Asia, but basically like urban types of environments. And so this has been called the weird sample. So weird Western educated, industrialized, rich democracies. But the reason why it's weird is because from the perspective, I'm an anthropologist, right? So from our evolutionary history, we've been living in weird societies for like a tiny little blip of our species history. And so not only are we weird in the sense that from our species perspective, this is a very different kind of lifestyle than we've ever had before, but even across the world today, right? We think about the global South and lots of places outside of North America and Europe, and yet we don't know a whole lot about their psychology. And so is it the case that what we see in the West replicates everywhere else? And so when the study was done, surveying, where are all the studies in psychology and social sciences done? Almost all of those studies are done in weird societies, whereas we only represent a relatively small percentage of the global population. So basically, the idea that psychology is weird, and so so Danny Blanchflower, more than anyone else, has been an economist, a force towards like promoting this U-shaped understanding of the world. Has been quoted: "The U-shaped happiness curve is everywhere." But again, not to be the annoying person in the room, like the anthropologist, like, well, but actually, do we know anything about happiness in other places around the world, and especially other types of environments? Isn't it a weirder thing to suspect that under all types of cultures and environments that you would see a similar age shape? Because again, this is not derived from any theory. This is just something empirically observed and then therefore interpreted that therefore it must be something real. So it turns out, and I think this was when Stephen contacted me, it was based on a paper that came out last year, where I actually looked at, there's not very many samples, and some of them were my own, but other places, basically in rural contexts, people who are dependent on the forest, and in low and middle income countries, what's the evidence for these types of life satisfaction curves over the life course? And actually, something that was published years ago for very different reasons. But this was, it was comparing Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, with a town in Ireland, but with two groups. The Kung are hunter-gatherers, so the Bushmen, if anyone's seen The Gods Must Be Crazy, that's these guys. And then the Herero are herders that live nearby the Kung. And this was subjective well-being score. And here from, midlife, this is 30 to 59, people 60 plus, lower well-being. It was declining with age in the Herero. Here's a little bit the improvement you see after middle life in Swarthmore, and about the same in Ireland. So again, hints that in the two places where this was looked at, that were like small scale societies, it didn't look like it was a U shape. There was a study published comparing a sample in Poland. So the one slight exception in high-income countries tends to be in Eastern Europe, places that also have gone through some radical changes. We know, like in Russia, for example, the life expectancy has been going down, lots of alcoholism, stuff like that. So, and then compared with the Hadza, who are a group of hunter-gatherers in Tanzania. So in the Hadza, this is showing just both men and women. Again, sort of happiness score as a function of age. Basically no age differences across the population. And in Poland, if anything, it was actually declining with age. So again, exceptions to the U shape. And then, I got my hands on a sample from a colleague that was looking at three populations, the Baka, hunter-gatherers in Cameroon, the Hunan, these are hunter-gatherers from Borneo, and then the Chimane is a group I work with in Bolivia, but this wasn't something I collected. So an independent sample. And there was some evidence, again, this subjective life satisfaction score, some evidence of kind of a U shape, whether you looked at it parametrically with like a quadratic kind of equation, or if you just kind of looked at trend lines, low S smooth, basically showing similar patterns, slight U shape, although where the trough is tends to vary a little bit, and then but a decline in the Chimane case, decline with age. So that was a bit instructive, a bit more variability than we typically saw from high-income countries. And then moving further, this was a sample from 23 countries, a group of folks who are heavily reliant on the forest. So this was a study about conservation, actually, but they happened to collect data on subjective well-being that I got my grimy little hands on, and I looked at it as a function of age. And this was just a sort of across all these different countries. I highlighted in red for you, the ones that seem an exception to the U shape, right? So some of those exceptions are sometimes even like an inverted U, but a lot of times they're kind of flat. Sometimes they're going down with age. And even where there's an age shape, once you adjust for some of the things that tend to associate with age, a lot of these age effects disappear. So if anything, sort of flat or maybe inverted U might be fairly common in these rural contexts that might be more typically how we would have lived before cities. But again, showing more variation that would sort of strike, be at odds with this notion of a human universal. And if you just kind of cluster folks by continent, Africa and Asia versus Latin America. Latin America, okay, there's a little bit of a U shape here. Africa and Asia. Africa was sort of declining with age. Asia, again, sort of an inverted U. And it's a little bit different for males versus females, but here I'm just focusing on the age relationship. And notice,
Which are the happiest, the male? I can't read.
well,
Which line is the males and which one is the female?
oh, sorry, solid line here is our males. So in Africa, males happier than females, a little bit reverse in Asia. And then,
Females are happier.
yeah, but these error bars are fairly wide. The sex effect is not terribly strong. But the other thing too, which I don't do, is I'm not comparing across countries or continents, because there, it's hard to know whether people in different cultures are using the same yardstick, right? Within a culture, it might be more understandable. So I'm more interested in the relationships with age than about comparing those across countries. You can kind of do that, but you really need to harmonize your data collection in a way that you anchor your like really happy to really miserable, try to anchor them in ways that might make more comparable across cultures.
It's obvious that expectations must play a huge role, and societal expectations are different in different societies.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So even what you just said right there would be sort of what you might expect. And so it would be a bit of a shock that a U shape would be existing everywhere if
Right.
expectations shape your happiness. And, isn't that always the case? Happiness is reality divided by expectations, right? So it's always good to have low expectations if you want to be happy. But anyway.
Don't tell the students that.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I agree. And of course, then the question, where do these expectations come from? And we can get into that. But just to show you some of these results, I get into the weeds in the paper if you're interested in this kind of thing. I only put this in here because it's scientists, engineers. So most social scientists get lost in numbers and things like that. But if you specify a quadratic functional form, right? And if you have a positive quadratic, that's where you get your U shape, versus like in this case, you just let every age be its own kind of variable. So you allow any kind of nonlinearity in the age relationship. And I was basically finding the same thing, that I wasn't getting a U shape. So it wasn't like it was forced in there with the quadratic function. Whether you have cross-sectional or some longitudinal data, whether you adjust for covariates or not. And also in some cases, like in my own work, I had studies of depression. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but also just observer writing down whether you were smiling, laughing, fairly easy to talk to, like those independently of what you rate yourself in terms of your life satisfaction, also show similar I found declines in well-being with later age. So no matter how you looked at it in these variety of different models, I wasn't really getting so much of a U shape. Now, it actually turns out that low mood itself is not just a weird problem. So this is actually another group of economists, but they're development economists. So they looked more to the global south. Banerjee and Esther Duflo were Nobel Prize winners a few years ago. And from some of their work in India, and then collating some data, representative data from Costa Rica, Brazil, South Africa, Malawi, basically showing this is just percent likely depressed, that it's not trivial, and it tends to increase a little bit with age. So here's the US, so a little bit on the lower side and not really increasing with age. So maybe that is consistent with like a potential U-shaped increase in well-being, but that's certainly not the case in a lot of other places. A lot of the attention in the global south tends to be on infectious disease, but there's sort of a whole untapped focus on mental health as well. So again, this flies in the face of this idea that a U-shape might be a human universal. And so again, with more recent data, this is global burden of disease data. Some of our best data we have out there for making assessments of what diseases and sicknesses exist over time. and across over 200 countries around the world. So this is from the Lancet just earlier this year. And this was showing that, so age standardized rates of depression per 100,000. So higher is more depression. And this is as a function of SDI is like socio-demographic index. Basically, it's a composite measure of like per capita income, formal schooling, and fertility. So basically, higher values just mean like more developed countries, so more first world, high income countries. And what you can see here is that in the lower income, low middle income countries that are less developed, we're seeing higher rates of depression. So again, lots of more to explore that has not been ignored or that has not been studied. Of course, well-being is not just one-dimensional. I focus mostly on these life satisfaction questions. And I think, we're going to see a lot more of this because in general, life expectancy is pretty high across lots of countries. We can complain that the US is like number 49. It could do better in light of other high-income countries. But life expectancy is not enough when we think about well-being. And so we're going to see more and more measures and attempts to measure, squishy feelings like happiness and life satisfaction, and to zoom out at a country level too, so that we can not just compare countries based on literacy rates or life expectancy, but also well-being. And so there's already moves to kind of do this again earlier this year, measures that focus not just on the health, physical well-being, but on emotional well-being, levels of meaning, character, social well-being, our financial security, spiritual well-being, wrapping these all together in what has been called flourishing. So we're starting to see now in 22 countries these measures of flourishing. And yeah, it's a bit interesting, and a lot of it doesn't actually show the same kind of U-shape that has been argued for a while. All right. So now I'm going to kind of segue into some of my own work on this topic. I've been working in Bolivia for over 2 decades, and this is with a group of small-scale Amazonian foraging horticulturalists. So these are folks who slash and burn farm for a lot of their living. So 2/3 of their calories come from their fields, but they also actively hunt, fish, and gather. So more of their time is spent doing those activities for protein and fat. But again, they do have fields and villages where they're surrounded by a lot of their kin. And I work in a lot of different villages, and some villages that are closer to town, others that are further away, which also gives us an opportunity to look at what are the effects of lifestyle change and modernization on well-being, on health, and all that kind of stuff. And I get into a lot of those aspects, physical health and aging, in the book I mentioned. So I co-direct this project called the Chimane Health and Life History Project. You might have heard something about that because the Chimane have the healthiest hearts that have ever been observed. Over 85% of people over the age of 50 have absolutely zero coronary artery calcification that we verified through. So you didn't ask me to come talk about that. Talk about that. But that's so it's interesting. Lots of interesting lessons and contrasts. Again, and we never would have known that because people like the Chimane are rarely studied for things like heart disease, right? They're usually studied because they have tuberculosis or malaria and that kind of thing. All right. This is just showing you a little bit the kinds of foods in the diet, like a coatimundi. This is a paca, like a big rodent. Lots of fish in the diet, lots of harvested fruits, like palm fruits and such. And then from people's fields, you've got plantains, corn, papaya, sweet manioc, which is a type of root, and also some rice. And again, lives are fairly actively social. People, if you have walls in your house, it's just, you can see through the cracks. So things are very much out in the open. You can walk to see those people in your community. And people are surrounded by family. The average woman has about 9 kids over her life course. So you can imagine how many grandkids she might have. And so, yeah, life a bit more social than what we take for granted in how we live. I've also worked with another group, the Mosa 10, who their language is very similar to Chimane. So the two of them together form an isolate. And in many ways, I've studied the Mosa 10 because they represent almost like what the Chimane might be 20 years from now. Because based on where they live, they're a bit more modernized. They were missionized by the Jesuits. So they all speak fluent Spanish, and many have even lost their native language. And they're religiously Catholic. And so pegged more into kind of national society culture and more integrated into the market economy. And so it's kind of a nice contrast. And I won't say very much about them, but a little bit I will. All right. And from some earlier observations back in late 2000, 2008, 2012 data, this was using a 16-item questionnaire looking at different aspects of depression. So not a single item life satisfaction. And by this, I mean, this might seem like a small number by the standards of large countries, but that's a huge number for small scale society, almost 2,000 people. And when we looked at depression score, so a higher score means more depression, for both males and females, there's two curves here. One is just the quadratic, and another one is just sort of a trend line without non-parametric, all showing the same thing for males and females, that if anything, depression is increasing on average with age. Now, granted, that's on average, right? When you see the raw data, there's lots of variability. And age itself is not even the most instructive variable. Even in some of those analyses that Blanchflower talks about, they're focusing on the age effect, but age itself is not a huge contributor to variability in how happy people are, which is also, I think, an important lesson that often gets missed. Yeah, so this part is a little weird, right? So if it's depression, it should be the inverse, right, of happiness. So here, people are getting more depressed as they head towards middle age, right, as opposed to less depressed. Or sorry, I messed that up. That part is consistent with the U shape of declining well-being, right? This is worsening ill-being. But here is where it's different, right? Rather than getting less depressed with age, people seem to be getting more depressed with age on average. Looked at another way with more recent data. So this was looking at happiness, like do you feel joy and happiness now in your life? Comparing answers of often versus sometimes or never. And the probability of being happy, both Chimane and Mosa 10, from the 40s on, was declining for both males and females. And sex was not different.
So what kind of reasons I know an individual one doesn't matter so much, but what's the trend that's making it?
Yeah.
What do they feel like?
I will get to that.
Okay, sorry.
If I skip it, then bring it up again. But this right now, how do I reconcile these data, right, with the U-shaped happiness curve? But again, I mentioned that paradox of old age, the upswing, and the reasons that are usually given, like in the US, is that, with age, it kind of blunts that sharp edge of ambition. You learn to appreciate what you have. You focus on the positive. There are interesting experiments that show that older folks are more likely to remember positive aspects of things that happen and discount or forget negative things. And so maybe there's more appreciation and acceptance with your lot and seeing the upside of things. You're past those periods of striving and competition. So there's good sort of things that seem reasonable for why well-being might improve with age. But clearly that doesn't happen everywhere. And so here's where I think gets at some of the reason. So that we'll see increased well-being with age under various conditions. So, and here's where if you imagine the contrast between sort of the subsistence-oriented rural type populations in blue with characteristics of more urban post-industrialized societies like ours. So where you have formal retirement versus in Chimane, Mosa 10, and those types of rural contexts, there is no retirement at all. where you have income and social security versus no formal institutions for protecting either your health or your well-being, job security. So you're just reliant on other people. When you make a living through more of a service information economy, and so your physical health per se isn't necessarily as critical, versus if making a living is heavily dependent on your physical body, then you can imagine when your health starts declining, that might affect your well-being. So again, and where there's adequate health care versus minimal health care. But you also increase well-being when you're embedded in a social community versus being more socially isolated. So this idea that there's challenges in later age, but to the extent that we can still feel capable, useful, and needed, and we can accommodate those challenges, if those accommodations outweigh those challenges, then I think you might see an increase in well-being. But when those challenges sort of outweigh these other aspects, then we start to see something on the flip side. And studies I've done have bear this idea out. So in evolutionary oriented kind of takes on our lifespan, there's this idea that, from a perspective of natural selection, living beyond age 50 is kind of weird, right? Most species out there in nature, if you can no longer reproduce, you're no longer living. And so from the perspective of natural selection, this, in essence, the aging of our body tends to go hand in hand with the aging of our reproductive system. But humans, we're weird, right? We have actual menopause, and not only menopause, but living beyond the age of menopause. And this is not something just because of the last 80 years or 100 years of medicine and public health infrastructure, but it's something that's actually built into our species design. That's sort of one of the big themes of my book. And so it's typical even in hunter-gatherers that you'll have people living well beyond the age of 50. And so the focus on those older adults, what is it that they're doing? So if they're not directly reproducing, right, which would obviously increase their fitness, then maybe they're indirectly reproducing by impacting their fitness in indirect ways. So what's been proposed, you can imagine all the ways that, because it has to, in order to be relevant for fitness, it has to impact survival or fertility of your descendants who are related to you. And this is true. So older adults can still continue acquiring food that's transferred to others who might not be able to get that food themselves. That improves their health and survival, could also improve their fertility. If pregnant and lactating women don't have to work as hard, they might actually be able to have a shorter interbirth interval and actually have more kids per year than if they had to rely on their own efforts to go and get food during those critical periods. Older adults provide support, advice, excellent storytellers when there's no ChatGPT and Wikipedia and all that, even encyclopedias. In the absence of books, elders are critical for all types of education and cultural knowledge. They make tools, fix tools, and also taking care of kids and grandkids. So all these different ways that they can help and make a difference. But that being said, so there's fitness value to being alive, but this is sort of an idealized sort of take about production. Now, production could be like your income, it could be food, like in hunter-gatherers, but let's just think of it most broadly as the value you provide to others. And, it might be low, then it increases in adulthood, but there might be a point at which that value starts to decline. And certainly over grandparents, there's still lots of surplus value. I just threw in age 50 here. But there's this period where people can be viewed as assets to their family, assets maybe to their society. And then there's this idea of being at an age where you're receiving more than you might be giving, and this idea of a burden. Of course, this is familiar to all of us, but this is, in all these old ethnographies, there's this distinction between like the young old and the old, folks who can't take care of themselves anymore, and who don't live very long anymore under this context. And even some drastic measures like geronticide exists in cases when people end up in this most frailest of stages. And then, of course, everything in between. And it's not so obvious where people are in this like transition from asset to burden. But here is definitely the period, though, when things are starting to fall apart and happiness wouldn't necessarily be expected to be increasing perhaps over that period. And so, with this kind of framing, this idea, I've developed this kind of model of how the productivity and value you have to others is a function of your own physical condition and health. And, to the extent that you're embedded in these networks, in some ways it's more complicated because others are reliant on you. No one, well-being, one of the biggest factors we saw in the Chimane that predicted people's well-being was if they were giving away more food than they were receiving. Do you think, well, all else equal, isn't it better to receive than to give? No. If you're receiving more than you're giving, you're dependent on others, and people don't like to feel that they're dependent on others, and those folks actually were the most depressed. And there's studies that show kind of analogs to this in our own society. This is not unique to the Bolivian context. But you can see how that's all kind of wraps up notions then of well-being. And so what I started doing with, just in the Chimane context was, looking at productivity, for years, my background in anthropology is called behavioral ecology. And a lot of we focus on is food acquisition. And a lot of my original studies were actually on the biology of altruism and study of cooperation in the context of a hunting and gathering lifestyle. And so I would do a lot of weighing food and counting calories and see where calories are going. And of course, there's huge amounts of food sharing in these types of small scale societies. But that's because, it's the easiest thing to focus on because you can weigh calories. And so, yeah, we can think of production in terms of hunting, fishing, horticulture, and also, prepping food, cooking food, fetching water. But there's other activities too, like building and repairing houses, making tools, making handbags, caring for sick, visiting others, telling stories, making music, teaching others, giving advice, mediating conflict. And those things are harder to measure on a day-to-day kind of basis, but it's something that certainly we know middle-aged and older adults do in these kinds of societies, but it's never really been measured. And so in doing this, now with over 1,000 people over the age of 47, again, a lot of variability, but just the proportion of these activities that people said, yeah, they did in the last month. You can see shows a peak here, and then it tends to decline in the 70s and 80s for food-related activities most steeply. But some of these other things, maybe not as steeply. It does tend to decline more steeply for men than for women. So men's economic activities are more labor-intensive than women's economic activities in the society. But when you sum it across the board, actually people can continue making sustained contributions and be valuable even when their physical, musculature is declining and they're not hunting and fishing as much as they used to. So there's other ways of being kind of important members of society. But those are sort of the key aspects towards people's value that makes a difference. And then I'm arguing here, contributes to their well-being. And so if we just take that same relationship of depression increasing with age, here's where you kind of map it. And from every time, so I have a mobile medical clinic. And, once every year, every 2 years, we see everyone in the population. And we've done this over a number of years. And so if we look at, I count how many clinical diagnoses of health problems you have. And this is, you might not be able to see the numbers. This is 0 up to 6, right? So higher number, higher level here, it means more health problems, and you can see more depression score, higher depression score. And it actually turns out that your physical health is more predictive of your depression than your age. I mean, age is still significant, but health explains more of that variability. So again, consistent with that notion that in these types of society, if your physical health is compromised, your ability to do all these other things becomes compromised, and then that affects your overall well-being here. So depressed affect was also associated with higher physical disability, we found, lower economic productivity, greater food insecurity, and more conflict with kin. And this, I'll just walk you through this because I know the text is small. Basically, if you could still chop down big trees, which is an important task to do, you were, sorry, this is yes, you were less depressed. Can't chop trees anymore, more depressed. Can you still lift a bag, a heavy bag like of rice? If you can, less depressed. If you can't, more depressed. Can you still weave these handbags that people use to carry things? If you can, less depressed. If you can't, less depressed. Here's just your own self-assessment of health. So this is separate from the medical doctor's diagnoses, but basically from muy mala, so very bad, up to very good, there's a stepwise, worse, lower depression, the healthier you thought you were. These are the activities of daily living. Can you go to the bathroom by yourself? If this is basically towards no, you can't do it at all by yourself. More depression, and same thing with mobility. You can't get around by yourself. More depression. So again, these physical aspects and functional aspects of daily activities matter a lot for well-being. So you might think, isn't it bad enough that if your health is declining, what the hell's the point of also feeling bad on top of that? Right? Why is there lower mood? And why would there be lower mood in later life, particularly? And this is where, from an evolutionary perspective, the emotions are not just these things that get in the way of, what our brains are really set out to do. Darwin himself argued that the emotions were like evolved, functions that help us push us, in one direction or another. And so you can think of, rather than, emotions are just something to get over, why do we feel them in the first place? What goals are they actually achieving for us? And with this kind of insight, the field of evolutionary psychology, has been a lot of work on various emotional states and thinking about things like depression. And so the idea of why would you have lower mood in later life? Some ideas have focused on the signal value, like you're communicating need for help in your social network, right? And in more severe cases, that it's like a bargaining chip, especially if you're a valuable member in your group. If you slow down and all of a sudden you're not producing as much because you're depressed, others take notice because they're self-interested, right? They want you to return to being a high producer because they benefit from that. And so going on strike in a way actually can be effective. It could signal yielding, in competitive conflict as a way of saying, I'm not competing with you. There's been a lot of work done on those sort of ruminative aspects of depression, like you're slowing down and trying to figure out what to do next in life. If you have a problem, how can you cope with those challenges? Maybe something's not working for you and you should disengage and try something else. Another interesting idea, we actually found some support for this too in the Chimane case, that depression has symptoms that mimic aspects of sickness behavior that have been observed in lots of different species. And one idea is that this sort of slowing down and conserving energy is helping to mount immune responses to fight infection. So all of these things can be, you can imagine at later ages, in this sort of transition from asset to burden, a reassessment of, where you should be investing your efforts, how can people make themselves useful in their groups, if something's not working because all of a sudden your health is compromised in ways that you can't hunt like you used to. And so now you're finding other ways to be valuable and to have others be invested in your well-being. And so, those are some interesting ideas to think about. The one thing we don't, I should say, now with longitudinal data, what we don't see is chronic depression. So there's a lot of acute depression that might be situational, but then as situations change, we're not necessarily seeing the same people depressed in the same way that we do see more chronic depression in our own societies. All right. I do want to say the U-shape itself, and including actually Danny Blanchflower is now promoting this, no longer applies to the global north, but not for the reasons that I talked about. I mean, what I was talking about was from age 50 and on. And there you can see that well-being is still sort of increasing with age. This is comparing 2005 to 2018 versus 2022. And so before, 2019 or so, before the pandemic, this was sort of like a more typical U-shaped type curve. But now what's different is the lead up. And if anything, life satisfaction is improving over the life course because people in their late teens and early 20s are more miserable now than ever before. And so it's not that you're feeling good and then things get worse to a trough. It's just that you're feeling miserable and things are getting better. We can talk about this. There's a lot of explanations that might be more US specific, but now this has actually been observed in, I think, about over 10 different high-income countries. And so, which runs the gamut from screen time, social media and the quest for likes to, problems, making a living, affordable housing, political polarization, all these things you can imagine that are kind of contributing to things here. And it's unclear, is this just a cohort effect, right? In other words, there's this age, but these are people of a certain age at a certain time, right? And so it's unclear how things might look moving into the future. But even in the cross section, at least, we're no longer seeing that U-shape now. So again, the U-shape not being a universal, but something that was just sort of an empirical description at one point in time. All right, so what have we learned so far? First of all, be careful when making generalizations about human behavior, especially about claims about universality. And what I showed, you don't even have to go to the hunter-gatherers per se to find evidence of variability, but just sort of looking outside our standard approach of, UCSB undergrads, right? They're there. They're so easy to study. That's why almost all psych studies are with university undergrads. Or the big quest is to go outside the university and go within the community. But again, if you're making claims about human universals, then we need to think more broadly. But we also need actual theory, right? Again, the U-shape was not derived from any kind of theory. In fact, there are lots of theory papers that tried to develop theories after the empirical observations were made. On a positive side, don't despair, right? Midlife crises are not universal. And of course, I mentioned before, averages obscure variability, individual life trajectories matter anyway. So whether happiness is rising or falling really depends on the balance between those challenges I mentioned that we experience at later ages and those accommodations. So in rural subsistence type contexts, those challenges perhaps outweigh the accommodations. Whereas, and this is a good thing in our society, that if we're in a situation where those accommodations can outweigh the challenges. So the methodology does matter, right? But it's more than just refining our statistical methods, which is where a lot of this literature gets hung up on, isn't enough, right? That the cultural, ecological, and structural factors that make up our societies, those matter. So, and of course, we need to move beyond just simple metrics I started off with the simple metric because it's easy to ask, it's easy to measure, and then it's easy to come up with big data sets. But of course, it's not really telling us everything we might want to know about happiness and well-being. So I know it's getting on a little bit and some of you are falling asleep. So I'll just give you a little hint about what I'm working on now. And then if there's interest, I do have some more slides about what I'm working on that show some preliminary results, but I don't want to keep talking if you guys are worn out. So, but here's what I'm working on. How do people in these rural subsistence-oriented groups like the Chimani, how do they think about happiness and the good life? And is this something that's changing with market integration and modernization? What are the main worries and problems that people have? Are lives of elders better now compared to the past? We tend to think that, well, elders are wedded to the past and traditions, and to some extent that could be true, but they also might be a little bit healthier now. Healthcare access might be a good thing. It might be if you're more sedentary, and by sedentary I mean living is less mobile, having to move camp a lot. That's kind of rough, right? So now if you live in like a more permanent settlement, maybe that's a little bit easier. Does the threat of livelihood, culture loss, discrimination, do those feature as big concerns in people's assessments of well-being, and particularly of elders? How do families navigate or negotiate this sort of asset to burden type transition? What about, all over the place, right? In our society, we hear about the loneliness epidemic, how we're increasingly more and more physically, socially isolated, and that's leading to more loneliness. Are those problems that exist also in small scale societies where people are embedded in these larger social communities? One argument has been that loneliness is a novel thing that didn't exist prior to industrialization when we all lived in these tight-knit communities. The short answer I can say is that's not true. We do see loneliness in groups like the Chimane. How does social support, that embeddedness, affect and be affected by changes in physical health in later adulthood? So I'm really interested in the interactions between health, aging, and the sort of social world and emotional world that people are embedded in. All right. And just maybe this is the last thing of how am I going about doing that? So one thing, and again, this is my training too, I like asking people questions and doing surveys, but I like behavior and I like direct observation. So focal follow observation. So this is like me showing up to where you live for like a couple hours and every 5 minutes jotting down what you're doing and who you're with, who are you talking to, what are you talking about, where are you? And then if I get that enough times with you and with lots of people, I can get a nice snapshot of what do people in their 50s versus 60s versus 70s versus 80s do. Who are they surrounded with? Are they isolated? Are they talking? Who are they talking with? Who are they spending their time with? Are they still actively involved in various things? So that's priceless information. Also a series of biographical interviews, sort of continued of a depression inventory that also talks about worries that people have. I showed you some interviews about productivity. I've done more detailed ethnographic interviews with people that gets at all these different aspects of the quality of those later years, right? Not just the quantity of those years. So yeah, I don't know. I feel like I've been talking for a while. I could show more if you'd like, but I also want to give you guys all a chance to talk. So any questions, comments? Yes.
So you did mention suicide.
Yeah.
The rates of suicide among these indigenous people compared to we here in America?
Yeah.
Is there much of that you've experienced?
Yeah. So the rate, right? Because obviously the numbers are so small because it's a small population, but the rates are a little bit higher than what we have here for in older age. And again, the suicide rates here tend to be a bit more elevated at later ages. Now, from what just being around a while, it used to be a thing, and especially like if a spouse died, you often saw the remaining spouse die coincidentally, like within a year or two. And oftentimes people will talk about they would essentially like just eat carbon, or sorry, by ashes and dirt, and basically just let themselves go. That they were just, and this was a signal like, don't even like look out for me anymore. I don't want to live anymore. And there's a little bit of that too with not just from becoming a widow, but also the frailty that some people just reach a stage they don't want to live anymore. And their family will try to, step in a little bit. But so what we don't see, at least in the Chimane context, is outright geronticide, which has existed in a lot of different cultures in the past. It's one of those things that tends to change with kind of acculturation and intervention of the state. One thing that's kind of interesting now that didn't exist before is because elders are now kind of cued into the state. If nothing else, you can get the equivalent of about $70 a month from Social Security. And so that's a ticket that ensures, if nothing else, you're worth $70 a month just by living.
Does Chimani have Social Security?
Yeah, from the state. So now, only in the last 5 to 10 years have people actually have the ID cards that then allow them to go. And they often go themselves. And so there's sometimes like their kids will go, and you can accumulate. You can get like 6 months worth at once because people aren't near town enough to go every month. It'll be interesting because now there's a new president that Bolivia, and I think these programs might go by the wayside. But that's a novelty that I think makes people a little bit more invested in elders who might be frail than would have been the case probably in the past. Yeah, Stephen.
Okay, so I saw the one graph where they talked about how many identified problems, physical problems, and then it created a curve by age. It almost seemed like it was like a ladder.
Yeah.
And so the more problems, then you
Health
start to
problems,
drop off.
yeah.
Health problems,
Yeah.
If you had just 2 identified health problems, you were much worse off than. So do you have like a relationship of how that works with age and with the number of problems?
Yeah, interesting, because right, you might expect that with age you get more health problems. But what's interesting is that's less age related as you would think, because again, this is a context where still almost more than half the morbidity is from infectious disease. So we see sickness at almost all ages. In fact, if anything, a lot of the sickness is concentrated early in life and then becomes a little bit less common. And we actually see some of our older adults having fewer health complaints than like middle-aged. So especially middle-aged folks who are still working heavily often complain about lower back pain. That is probably a human universal.
Yeah.
We see lower back pain everywhere. And so, yeah, there's an age effect, but it's fairly weak on like the number of problems that people have. Yeah. And what we don't see, actually, part of what I should have maybe having enough context here, because we don't see a lot of I mentioned there's not very much heart disease, there's not very much, obesity, diabetes, dementia. So the types of chronic non-communicable diseases that sort of accumulate with age, we just don't have that here. Not very much. And even when your blood pressure is elevated by the time you're 80, you're not dying of hypertension, right? You're still dying of even just pneumonia or a common cold because your immune system is basically shot. That seems to still be the case that across the board, 50% of deaths almost at all ages are due to infectious disease.
When you're working with Chimani, and you showed us their diet, these looking things, are you eating that food yourself?
Oh yeah, of course.
Really?
Yeah. Participant observation, right? Part of the way, one of the reasons I've been able to work with this group for over 20 years is people trust me. And certainly one of the best ways of gaining people's trust, one is trying to learn their language, right? And trying to be like an insider a little bit. And so certainly, and if I really want to get an understanding of people's culture and livelihood and everything, I kind of need to experience it myself, right? So yeah, I've eaten everything that they eat. I can't say I can do all the things that they do. I mean, God, even
Are
just
we talking weeks or months? How long are you having that diet?
oh, well, I mean, nowadays, I was just there in August but now like my team is big enough and we have a cook. And so, we're trading sometimes for meat and things like that. But it's not like I'm, in the early days, it was just me and I would just kind of live in villages for, months at a time. And so, yeah, I was just eating what people were eating.
And you
But
felt good? You had energy and
yeah, I mean, I got sick here and then, but the food was actually pretty good. I thought. I mean, fish, from the river is pretty amazing. Plantains, manioc is good. Actually, manioc is rarely eaten except by kids. It's brewed into a local beer. And when there's big vats of this beer, sometimes that's all people will eat or drink, for days on end. It's like party central. But it's not the kind of beer, it's sort of a thick, kind of milky type beer, because it's just a fermented root. But yeah, so eating local foods for sure.
Just one,
Yeah.
one more question. The one of your global north slides towards the end, you showed this younger people having more depression after the pandemic. If you move that out, let's go to 2032. Do you think that same group is going to be in 2032? Are they going to move out to be 10 years older? Are they still going to be depressed, or do you expect them to recover?
It's a good question. That's outside my wheelhouse. I think your opinion is as good as mine. Yeah, so the idea, how much of it is life stage dependent and that will grow out of this versus this is just a cohort. I mean, a lot of us tend to think, what 19-year-olds are going through now compared to when we were 19, I was 19 or you were 19, is life harder now? And what's the prospects for those folks down the road? I don't know. I do tend to think that this is going to drag a bit and we're going to see changes in the levels. And so it's going to be lower across the board. But as far as the shape, I don't know. I think it might just sort of get a little bit more flat, would be my guess. I mean, so much depends on what we do in society and how. That's why a lot of the take in my book I have is rather than like, let's just hope for coming up with a miracle drug that is going to reverse aging. Like there's immediate needs now about the quality of life. And there's so much untapped potential with our elders in society that could help improve their well-being, but also could help improve the well-being of everyone, right? Like, and this goes back to like what elders do in small-scale societies, right? The role of grandparents and the role of elders in kind of shaping and socializing is so critical. And in our society, we have some of these elder programs where elders are matched with teenagers that might be having behavioral issues in schools. We have that here in Santa Barbara. And what's amazing about those kinds of programs is, first of all, it makes elders happier. So they've done the studies before and after doing these kinds of programs, elders feel happier. They feel they're making more contributions, and those teenagers also feel happier. They're more likely to go to college, and they're less likely to have drug problems and other behavioral problems in schools. So again, it's like a win-win. But when you ask people who are directing these programs, why is it so hard to find elders volunteering for this? Why are these not more common given the shortages in our schools and whatnot? And the number one answer is always, well, yeah, there's a demand for this, but elders can't get to where the kids are, right? They don't have a car. They can't drive, or they don't drive at night. And so it's a structural issue in our society to meet that demand. That's just untapped potential. And to me, solving that issue is a way of dealing with aging that is much more, I think, immediate payoffs than the hope for, the new form of metformin that will, make us live to 130 or something like that. I was getting on my pedestal there, but it's all in the book. Yeah.
You're saying that it's to bring older people to younger people do like mediating, or is it like?
See, this is why you're right here,
Yeah.
right? Because you're paying attention to your phone.
Yeah.
See, and so you're. Can I repeat what?
It was just like how the context that I was getting at the end of what you were saying is that older people can have some use for younger people. Is that what it was?
Oh, well, yeah, I guess, well, part of the argument was that there's things that we can do to help improve the well-being of older adults, but we shouldn't just even think of it as like altruism towards our elders, because the ways of improving the well-being of older adults, it's still in our society, it's the same in these small-scale societies: feeling needed, feeling valuable, being a contributing member, participating more broadly in our social community. And by doing those things, you're actually having big impacts on your community. You're having impacts on school-age children. Those are the obvious ones where programs already exist, like literacy programs with young children or teenagers with behavioral issues. But if we threw our creativity, you can imagine lots of different programs and lots of different ways logistically to make these kinds of intergenerational programs available, and that would do a huge amount. That would also help solve, part of the big splash about the global population aging, right? It just sort of treats everyone post-retirement age as non-producers, non-productive, right? And that's going to have to shift in a large. And it has, I mean, it's in a way, it's going back to how we used to live, which was there was never actual retirement and people were contributing members, but not necessarily they're doing the exact same thing, right? People are not actively hunting all through their 70s and 80s. They're shifting what they're doing. There's still ways for them to be contributing members rather than just you're retired and now you get pushed away and withdraw. Yeah.
So I guess it's more of like a general involvement, but it's like more open as to how they can be creative with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Looks like Robert's got a question.
Oh.
Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, hi. At the very beginning of your talk, you said something about your book wanted to push back against the idea that we're on the verge of living much longer. Did I understand that correctly? Can you say something about what you meant to say?
Sure. Well, it's funny. I recognize you've gone to almost every talk I've ever given in the last 20 years. And I think you saw me give a talk on aging not too long ago. Yeah, well, I guess the point I kind of make in the book is that it's good that there's the David Sinclairs and the Brian Johnsons and the people out there, the tech bros who are trying to push the envelope, right? We need some of that out there. If we just said it can never be done, then it definitely wouldn't be done. But my point is just, I'm going to take a different tack and focus on what I see as more low-hanging fruit is dealing with the situation we're in now. But certainly the trajectory we're on, all the gains in life expectancy that we've seen are rapidly diminishing. So in every high-income country, it no longer looks like this optimistic linear increase in life expectancy that we saw over the past 100 years. So those gains are going to be a lot less. And so I think sort of in the, what is that? That Moore's law? You're engineers, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Where's
Right. So we're going to have to spend a lot more and more just to get increasingly less and less gains in life expectancy. And certainly the trajectory, the US and UK are on with chronic non-communicable diseases, it's not going to be easy to change that situation. So yeah, the only thing that was probably going to work is going to be some complete game changer in regenerative medicine, and that doesn't exist. So in the whole longevity field, there's nothing really that is slowing and reversing aging, in my opinion. Now, people can argue about what is aging and GLP-1, isn't that making a difference? Yes or no? Is that really slowing aging versus just, doing something else? But so yeah, I would say, I'm trying to remember now exactly what the question was. Do I think we're going to be living? The optimists that say the first 150-year-old has already been born. Yeah, I'm skeptical of all that. I feel like, so the book is called 7 Decades, partly because the idea is that I argue that over evolutionary time, our body was built to last about 7 decades. And under current environments, under good conditions, that's shifted, right? I would say that's more like 8 or 9 decades. And still, the most robust of us within that area can do better, of course. But I just don't see that there's been anything that's going to completely change our underlying biology. I do think we're going to be able to, under the best of situations, right? There's a list. It's all about prevention, right? If we had like 8 simple habits, you could probably increase your life expectancy by quite a bit. There's things like where tech can actually be used to help us live in our homes for longer, right? From smart canes to exoskeletons, right? That could help us walk when we become more frail. So I think, there's workarounds to help improve our situation and our quality of life. But I don't think there's anything out there that has really changed our underlying biology in a way that has slowed down aging in the last 50 years. So yeah, I lean on the cynical side, but I certainly am not against people going in that direction, because I do think, well, we're not going to make any advances if someone's not doing it. It is kind of curious that all the tech bros are bros. Do you ever notice that? It's only men that want to kind of live forever, it seems. Well, and at least in the US, Pew studies have shown that most Americans don't really want to live beyond 90. And even if the medicines were available, said they didn't want to live, a good majority didn't have interest to live beyond 100, 130. And so, but partly that's because of what their expectations are about what those later years might be like. On the one positive aspect, most young people, when you ask them what a whole variety of things, what it's like to be over age 65, and you compare people over age 65 with what they say, yeah, the expectations are that his aging is a lot worse than it seems to be by the people who are in those later ages. So the other thing too, I think, is just building better models of what aging could actually look like, right? For the younger generation, so that it might actually be something that people even look forward to, rather than something that people dread more than death. Even Pew surveys show that people are more scared of aging than they are of dying.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is you be able to talk about like the effect of like income inequality or wealth disparities or anything like that? What's the effect on that?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think that's just another element too, that when we think about longevity extension, I think a lot of us might be thinking about, what's a pill that we could take as an individual to make us live longer. But the reality of all that stuff is, one of the reasons, I don't know what detail we want to get to, but inequality usually doesn't work for the betterment of health at large. Right? Certainly the wealthier can be healthy in any country, but even in our country with rampant, inequality, there's externalities, right? So if there's what's a good example of this, like with more inequality, and if people don't feel safe in their neighborhoods, for example, it doesn't matter how much money you have, you don't feel safe in your neighborhood, that increases stress. You're less likely to go outside, be physically active, less likely to hang out in parks because you're worried about homeless people. So there's these negative repercussions on everybody. And so, which is probably why, even when you stratify by income, the wealthier in the US are not doing as well as the wealthier in Sweden and France and other places. But probably part of the reason why, I mean, I was amazed. So my wife gave birth in France. And our experience with the healthcare system there was not very good. And I was amazed. So first of all, is this being filmed?
You want me-
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Actually, we probably
recorded.
should wrap
I can,
up too.
I'm gonna edit it, so I
Oh.
can cut this part out.
Yeah.
I didn't want to insult my French audience, but let's put it this way: I was just amazed that maternal and infant mortality is so low in France compared to the U.S. based on our experiences there. But then again, most people have above, basic level access, right? And it's the disparities that probably are leading to, the low averages for places like in the U.S. So yeah, I do think there's a point at which some of the problems of improving life expectancy, which is like a population measure, is going to require addressing some of these issues about poverty and income inequality, rather than just the version of metformin that can help us live longer and longer. Because even if your 90-year-old increases the likelihood they make it to 100, that's not going to actually have that big an impact on life expectancy as a population measure. What's going to have a much bigger impact on life expectancy at the population level is increasing survival throughout the rest of adulthood or earlier in life, right? Because more years are lost on average at earlier ages. Anyway,
All right.
Yeah.
I probably should just make an announcement. If there's any more questions or anything, why don't you just send them to the Science Engineering Council and I'll pass them along. So, but I think, yeah, we used up a lot of your time. We really appreciate it. Very great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
bye-bye, everyone.